Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Pilot Lawyer Podcast. Thank you for your attention while this important legal information is reviewed. What you hear should not replace consultation with an attorney and should not be considered advice for your situation. On behalf of the Pilot Lawyer and your entire crew, it's our pleasure to have you aboard.
Welcome, Aviators, to the Pilot Lawyer Podcast with us, the Ison Brothers, at the Ison Law Firm, where aviation law is all we do, nothing else. You're here for what we do best, navigating the FAA medical certification process for pilots and those who want to become pilots. And of course, if you don't laugh, you cry. And for the next 30 minutes, we hope to bring you the lighter side of what can otherwise be a frustrating process. So, whether you're laughing at us or with us, join us Ison Brothers as we discuss the fascinating... The Ison Brothers.
Uh-huh. Did you stumble over that?
Just a little bit.
Okay.
I caught myself, I thought, pretty well until you pointed it out.
No.
Jerks. As we discuss the fascinating world of FAA medical certification. Now, we're going to have to come up with some pretty good content here today.
We're up to 28 subscribers.
Yeah.
Which is crazy. But let me say this much. Let's talk about getting high. And I'm not talking about in an airplane. Don't do it. Yeah.
Don't pass the
There's
peace
your
pipe.
content. There's your content. So today we're going to talk about FAA medical certification and marijuana use. Our mom told us not to be silly on this one because she could just see all the stupid little banter we had coming down the pipe. But it can all be summed up in don't do it. So whether it's medical marijuana, recreational marijuana, or, hey, I was in a car and these guys are hotboxing it, or I ate a cookie at the FBO and it was laced with marijuana.
Were you in Denver?
Yeah, don't do it.
But let's say you have.
Oh, boy. So there's all sorts of problems that can come up. Number one, let's say a hypothetical individual, and I notice I say individual a lot on this podcast, but I'm referring to
What happened to your forehead?
Okay, I'll go into a brief story.
Yeah. That's a good question.
I was at lunch at our parents' house yesterday, and Atticus, our son, was telling us jokes from his joke book. And I just rested.
That funny.
No, I rested my head on the top of my Coke can because I thought, I'm just going to sit here and listen. I was really sleepy. And I'm going to rest my head on this Coke can here, which you had to be there. So, yeah, that makes sense. And I pulled my head up, and everybody said, "What's wrong with your forehead?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" And apparently the whole top of the can was imprinted on my forehead. What you see here today is the remnants.
I was talking about that thing between your eyes.
Yeah, that was where the little cracker thing is, the thing that cracks it open.
The tab?
Yeah, and that's with some of Emily's makeup on top of it. Weird.
Okay, so
So marijuana.
yeah.
So can you get a medical? Yes, but you're in for a bumpy road. And here's why. If you've ever used marijuana in your life, it's possible it's going to come out. And here's how that happens. One way we see it is, let's say you have some sort of medical problem and the FAA says, send us all your medical records relative to your diabetes. And let's say you've told your physician that while you're being treated for your diabetes, oh yeah, I smoke marijuana occasionally. And that gets into your medical records. And then that goes to the FAA. And the FAA sees, oh, you use marijuana. Then it's going to turn into an inquiry relative to your marijuana use. There's possible scenario number one. Possible scenario number two is that you're truthful about it.
You tell them.
Yeah, hey, question 18N, as in November, asks, have you used any illicit substances within the past 2 years? Now, as I make note in my blog titled FAA Medical and Marijuana Use, essentially, even though marijuana can be found on the street corners in just about any burg in the United States these days, as some sort of legal use is no longer and has never been considered legal from a federal perspective.
What do you mean no longer?
I don't know. I started to say no longer for some reason. But nevertheless, it's not legal federally. Question 18N on the medical application asks, in your lifetime, have you ever been diagnosed with, had, or presently have substance dependence or failed a drug test ever, or substance abuse or use of an illegal substance in the last 2 years? So if you don't doze off reading how many little things they're asking for in 18N, and you finally get to the last little thing, it says use of an illegal substance in the last 2 years. And even if you have medical marijuana,
A prescription?
a prescription for marijuana, it's still considered illegal from a federal perspective and is something you should report at question 18N as in November. So there's that. We've also seen cases where individuals identify marijuana at question 17A as a medication they're taking. Obviously, yeah, I guess if you're using medical marijuana, sure, you should put that down. But at the same time, that's going to trigger an inquiry.
Well, it would seem to me, when you're looking at 18N and all of the ors, ethers or ors, when it comes to substance dependence, substance abuse, like let's say that you're not the type of individual that's getting diagnoses for substance dependence or substance abuse because of your past or present use of marijuana, right? Is there a distinction between how clinical medicine would diagnose someone as having substance dependence or substance abuse because of their marijuana use versus the FAA and how they would define substance abuse or substance dependence?
Yeah, so there's a difference between the DSM-5 standards, Diagnostics and Statistical Manual, which is what the clinical world uses, and the regulatory world, which speaks to substance abuse and substance dependence at 14 CFR 67107, 207, and 307, which is a copy and paste of one and the same.
I'm sure we could probably sit here and just get really deep in the weeds on
Weed?
See what I did there? On the DSM standards versus the regulatory standards, and how I think we could just suffice to say here very briefly, there's many cases where no one in their ever living mind would ever diagnose someone as having substance dependence or substance abuse under the DSM standards.
But they'd still be
they would still have it under the regulatory standards. And that's people just need to kind of get their heads around that.
Well, let's go back to how the FAA is going to find out about it, and then we'll really flog that idea. Is it okay if we have some continuity?
No.
Would that be all right with you?
I like to jump around from fact to fact.
Yeah, so that's why the viewership on these YouTube videos of this podcast are so low. People
up and down.
Yeah, they don't have time to piece it together. Number one it's in your medical records. Number two, you're reporting on your medical application. Number three could be something like a possession for marijuana, possession for paraphernalia, DUI charge that could potentially be the trigger for the FAA. So you would report that on your medical application. What else have you got?
Hotline complaint.
Hotline complaint, yeah.
That's always a good one.
Your grandma's tired of you smoking pot in her basement, and she says, hey, I'm going to call the FAA. I know that you file 787s. So that's a possibility. So to recap, what do we have, Alex? I thought we might incorporate Alex a little bit more.
So we have the hotline complaints. Is that what we're
Yeah.
Okay, hotline complaints, if you reported it under 18N, or if you sent in an erroneous medical record that has it referenced. I think.
And then you also had the DUIs and the possession charges.
Right.
17As.
17As, but yeah.
So there's all sorts of ways.
No, not to mention the fact if you report medical marijuana, then they're going to say, well, what's the problem?
What's the underlying issue that requires the marijuana?
In your clinical practice, Alex, as a doctor, did you ever see people using medical marijuana? Is it pretty prevalent?
Did you actually see it or did you hear about it?
I heard about it all the time. And then you get into the question, though, what about like CBD and all that stuff?
Yeah. So that's a good question.
Poppy seeds.
These non-THC products, quote unquote. What is that? Now, it's interesting that we're sitting here talking about because I wouldn't even know where to get it. I'm still of the mindset of that old folklore that you can get it where you see the shoelace shoes hanging over the phone lines. What with phones going to more digital forms? How are people
phone lines?
Satellites.
How are they going to sell their marijuana? I don't know how to get it. I've never used it. I wouldn't know where to get it, how to get it, or why to get it. But nevertheless, people seem to be doing it.
Wouldn't it be funny they put the shoes on the SpaceX satellites and just launched them?
Anyhow,
flippant.
where we're at with this is that it's possible for the FAA to find out about it. No, there's another one. Positive DOT drug tests.
Oh,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's a good one.
doozy.
Your pre-employment drug test.
Probably the worst one there is.
Yeah.
Because-
Maybe not pre-employment drug test, but a random drug test. You pop positive. Oh, well, I've been using this lotion that doesn't say it has THC in it, but turns out it's got, I'm really rubbing marijuana into my skin or whatever. We see that type of thing, or that's a pretty common thing. So there are ways they're going to find out about it. And the problem is that there's a big disconnect, especially between the people that want to get into flying that, hey, yeah, I've been smoking a joint every day my whole life because it's legal here in, Keokuk, Iowa. And as a result, I'm not sure if it is legal in Keokuk or even in Iowa. I'm not even sure if Keokuk is a real place.
You can probably say someplace in like
gonna-
California.
California, Colorado.
Maybe.
Florida probably at this point.
Somewhere.
Didn't Minnesota pass one?
No, when we went to Oklahoma.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Oklahoma
yes.
was pretty rough.
Ironic.
Yeah, there
Seemed like
with
that.
with the FAA.
Anyhow,
so it's possible they're going to find out about it. So as you were saying so poignantly, you must have taken your dose of coffee this morning or whatever it is you do.
I took my dose of coffee.
Yeah. And so you were saying how there's a difference between the clinical perspective and the regulatory perspective, as there is pretty much in all things relative to FAA medical certification. You could go to your doctor and say, hey, I'm using marijuana. And they could say, well, we don't care. Or they could say, yeah, we're going to give you marijuana as some sort of medical marijuana issue on which you may not meet criteria for substance abuse or substance dependence. But just by a mere one-time use, you could meet criteria for substance abuse under the regulation. And then you're working your way up from there, depending on how much you use it as to whether or not you meet criteria for substance dependence.
Has your FAA medical certificate been denied? Are you concerned you may not be able to get a medical certificate from the FAA? Are you at risk for FAA action for failing to report your medical history appropriately? Call the pilot lawyer at 1-855-FAA-1215 to discuss your options for getting the FAA to issue your medical certificate and get you flying. We are happy to evaluate your case and discuss with you a plan for presenting your case to the AME or the FAA. Aviation law is all we do, nothing else.
Is there a difference if you had to pick the lesser of one of these evils as far as getting your medical is concerned and the FAA saying, hey, you got that? Would you want to have substance abuse or substance dependence?
I'd much rather want to have substance abuse. May I tell you why?
Well, that was my next question.
So substance abuse only has a 2-year look back per the regulation, which gives you a lot of wiggle room when it comes to the FAA. So for example, let's say you had a DUI that was marijuana related. It's the only substance related offense you've ever had in your life. Or if you had a positive drug test for marijuana, or your last known use was beyond 2 years ago. Yes, the FAA is going to want to know more information about that. They're going to want a statement from you regarding your past, present, and future plans for use of marijuana and any mood-altering substances. They're going to want, if it's a DUI, they're going to want the arrest report and the court records and the driving record and so on.
Treatment records,
if there was any treatment. But in theory, if there was just some use and it was beyond 2 years ago, that gives you an argument to go to the FAA and say, hey, listen, I'm no longer using marijuana, if that's the truth. I don't have any intent on using marijuana in the future. And as a result, even though I may have met criteria for substance abuse at the time of my last use, I no longer meet this criteria because it's beyond 2 years. And typically the FAA is fairly reasonable with that argument. Will go along with it and tell you not to do it again. Now, the nuance there, if I may, is that one-time use of marijuana will meet criteria for substance abuse under the regulations.
Just one-time use?
One-time use. Essentially,
What if you don't
that's in
inhale?
our experience. Well, I don't know how it works, so I don't know. So if there's some documentation of your
Whatever
use.
the word, however you define use.
Yeah, well, that's a good question as well. But the thing is, in our experience, the regulations 67.107, 207, and 307 define substance abuse. And then at its essence, there you can read the regulation yourself, but paraphrasing is that any misuse of a substance at the Federal Air Surgeon's discretion can meet criteria for substance abuse. misuse at the Federal Air Service's discretion is any use of marijuana, what with it being illicit. Now, just because, let's assume the FAA were to, the federal government were to all of a sudden say that marijuana is legal. I still think they would consider use of marijuana illicit or misuse, if you will, at the FAA, because they do so essentially with alcohol. If alcohol, it can be used, but it can't be used in any problematic fashion. So just because marijuana could become legal doesn't really mean a whole lot.
Maybe if it was legal with a prescription, it wouldn't be illicit use. But if you're still just getting it off the street, that would be illicit.
But either way, no matter what.
That's a scenario to a problem that we don't really have right now.
Yeah. But here's a scenario we have. So you could always argue it's outside 2 years. Now, let's say you had a possession charge when you were a teenager or whatever. A lot of people want to freak out over that. Sure, it's something to be careful with, and the FAA is going to look at. But there's always a potential argument there to say, well, it's a possession charge. Maybe implies use, but did I really use it?
I was possessing it.
I was possessing it, but I wasn't.
I
wasn't possessed by it.
Unless the cop saw you actively consuming it.
Even if you had, again, it's over 2 years ago, you got the substance abuse. Let's say
you didn't even meet the threshold value of 2 years.
Yeah. Now you still have to report it, of course, blah, blah, blah. And the FAA is going to run you up the flagpole. Just make sure you don't slip and say something stupid.
Here's a real question for you, okay? Because I could see this being something somebody would call asking. You get arrested for possession. It gets dismissed. So there is no conviction, right? So now you're under no obligation under 18W to report it because there's no conviction for misdemeanor or felony, right? Then we go over to 18V. Well, because it got dismissed, did you have to go to any kind of educational rehab program? Let's just say for the sake of this argument, no. So there is no obligation as of 18V and 18W to report this possession arrest. Right? Let's say, though, in your lifetime that you had smoked it. Maybe you were smoking it when you got arrested for the possession.
Sounds like you were smoking when you came up with this.
No, I think I was just trying to cover some bases there at the outset. Do you still have to answer yes to 18N because of substance abuse?
That's a good question.
There's not a diagnosis. You've never been diagnosed with substance abuse, but technically,
Per the regulation,
you would have met the criteria for substance abuse. How anybody would know that?
That's really tough.
That's tough.
I'm not going to answer that one. It's going to depend on a case-by-case basis. You're going to have to call us at 855-322-1215. Talk to Jenna. She'll set you up.
Let me ask a potentially relevant question. We keep throwing this 2 years around.
What was the point of me asking?
I don't know. It's like a bar exam question.
We keep throwing this 2 years around.
But that's the point, though.
Oh my God.
Hang on a second.
See, this is why I don't ask questions.
Yeah, that's how complicated the whole thing is. I'm sitting here trying to figure it out. I can't give you a straight answer on that. Because, I guess technically I did have substance abuse for the regulation, but I was never diagnosed with it.
Right.
But how would I have known that I've been met criteria for abuse if I was just some Joe Blow?
The question asks, the regulation before you?
Yeah, but the question asks, have you ever in your life been diagnosed with previously had or presently have? And so that becomes the concern is that, well, okay, so maybe there wasn't a diagnosis, but did you previously have or do you presently have substance abuse because of something you did outside of 2 years ago?
Yeah, that's a good question. But I think the thing is, if you don't report, even if you did report that, though, I think the FAA would vet that and say, well, this guy doesn't meet or gal doesn't meet criteria for substance abuse. So, I mean, it's just hard to say. Now, what was your question, Alex? Let's get to that real quick. Over with. Stop looking at me like a lost puppy dog.
Okay, so you keep throwing around this 2 years thing, right?
Throwing it.
The look back. Say I smoked 6 months ago, right? Or yesterday.
Or you chewed up a gummy.
Or chewed up whatever. I did the Mary Jane, okay? Is the FAA going to want to say, like with some medications, they want to have like a period of time that you've been off of it, quote unquote?
Yeah, that's a good question. He's coming up with some questions. So the idea here is that if you have used it within the past 6 years, let's say those medical records sent in and said, hey, he was using it, last month or whatever, right? Yeah. The FAA is going to say you meet criteria for substance abuse. And so now you're in a spot where substance abuse is a specifically disqualifying condition under the regulations. And the only way to get a medical certificate, you're going to be required to get a special issuance authorization, which essentially is a waiver where they say, hey, we don't think you meet criteria for medical certification because you're a substance abuser, i.e. this use of marijuana, but we'll give you one anyways, pending you jump through some hoops to establish some ongoing level of abstinence. They'll want you to get with what's known as a HIMSS trained AME, aviation medical examiner, undergo testing for complete abstinence from all mood-altering substances, and then after a period of 2 to 3 months, have your complete airman medical file released to what's known as a HIMSS trained psychiatrist, have a HIMSS psychiatric evaluation, and then have that produced to the HIMSS AME. The HIMSS AME would generate a report indicating whether or not he or she is supportive of your issuance of a special issuance authorization. That would be submitted to the FAA. You'll wait a period of time for them to review the file. Then they'll issue your medical certificate and special issuance authorization and expect you to continue to remain abstinent from all mood-altering substances through ongoing monitoring and engagement with your HIMSS AME, meeting with the HIMSS AME every 6 months.
That sounds like more than just a couple hoops. This sounds like
the hoops are on fire.
Right.
And then the HIMSS psychiatrist, you'll meet with the HIMSS psychiatrist once annually, and then they will release you from the special issuance to a regular medical certificate as you were after a period of 2 years. Now, that's where things get a little bit gray as well. And I'd love for the FAA to call in and clear this one up with me.
863.
Yeah. Call Jenna.
Yeah.
The question
You'll
is...
have to still pay the consult fee.
There's a consult fee, FAA. So, now the question is, does the 2 years run from the last use on the special issuance? Am I going to be on special issuance from the last use 2 years? Am I going to be on the special issuance from the day I started the monitoring? Am I going to be 2 years from the date they issue the special issuance? Now, what they've been doing lately is 2 years from when they issue the special issuance. So you could be in a 6-month run-up trying to establish abstinence and waiting for them to come back with a decision and whatnot. And then that's, you could be in it for 3 years in theory. Plus, I think that's a bit insane in light of the fact that the regulation only calls for 2 years since the last misuse. So there's an argument there in a gray area, one which needs to be clarified by the FAA.
I guess by the time you get done going back and forth with them on it, you probably would be outside of the 2 years anyhow.
Yeah, that's the problem.
It is for them to respond to anything.
So slow. Now, so that being said, they're going to ask about, in the run-up to getting your special issuance, though, or any inquiry relative to substance use, they're going to ask about your past, present, and future plans for alcohol use. Alcohol? Well, they may ask about alcohol. I'm just such a one-trick pony.
Listen, if I'm going to smoke a joint, I'm going to have a fifth of vodka.
Yeah, that's probably so. That being said, you're going to end up in a spot where you could very easily fall into this substance dependence trap.
I'm sure there's people that say, I only smoke when I drink, and I drink quite a bit.
And I only drink when I smoke.
I joke with them.
Please, this is a serious topic. There are people out there just so upset they can't smoke anymore after listening to this podcast. So anyhow, where were we?
Gonna need a drink.
So we were talking about this turning into dependence.
Did the blog even reference dependence?
It briefly referenced dependence. Substance dependence is one of 4 criteria, and it's a lifetime look back. So there's increased tolerance, manifestation of withdrawal symptoms, impaired control of use, continued use despite damage to physical health or impairment to social, personal, occupational functioning.
Because it's a lifetime look back, whereas substance abuse is a 2-year look back. Is there a concern that if the FAA finds that you meet the regulatory criteria for substance dependence, that you'll have to be monitored for the rest of your life as opposed to maybe just a 2-year period under substance abuse?
That's absolutely right. So I will say the substance dependence for marijuana, we don't see that as much. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it certainly is.
I mean, if you write it in your personal statement, I can't quit the weed and the weed can't quit me.
Yeah. I can't stop this, or you've had multiple marijuana-related DUIs and those types of things, or your marijuana has caused you to have some sort of health problems, and your doctor says
the COPDs.
Yes, it's definitely what's causing this, and you continue to use it, and your doctor says, hey, you need to stop. And you could meet this criteria, but I'll tell you what the difference is. Substance dependence in order to establish that criteria for a special issuance authorization, the FAA is going to want to see, essentially, they're going to want to see recovery satisfactory to the federal air surgeon.
Rehab.
Yep. So they're going to want to see engagement with a treatment program, whether it's a 28-day inpatient treatment program, or sometimes they'll allow you to have engagement with an IOP, an intensive outpatient treatment program. After that, they'll want you to engage with a HIMSS-trained AME, aviation medical examiner, to engage in ongoing proof of abstinence through all mood-altering substances. They'll want you to engage in weekly group aftercare, participate in what they call the 90 and 90 peer-to-peer group meetings with something like AA or Birds of a Feather and so on in 90 days, and then continue that program with a sponsor thereafter. And then after a period of time of established treatment and abstinence, they'll want to see that you engage with a HIMSS-trained psychiatrist and then also a HIMSS-trained neuropsychologist to rule out any concerns relative to cognitive dysfunction.
I'm hearing a lot more ka-ching.
There's a lot going on there. And then ultimately, you're going to have to produce all that data to the FAA for them to review. And typically, that will take a fairly significant period of time to move forward from there. So all of that being said.
And all that goes on while you have the certificate, correct? I mean, it's not like that ends per se.
So once you're issued the medical
that's the lead up to getting the medical.
Yeah,
right.
And then once you get the medical, you'll have to continue doing HIMSS monitoring for as long as you hold a medical certificate in what they call the step-down program. Now you're going to be doing the same stuff. It'll eventually step down, but one misstep, and you're right back to kind of having to establish recovery once more.
Real quick, I could just say or ask. Maybe I could say, but I'll ask. When you say all mood-altering substances, we're not just talking about marijuana. Like, let's say the drug of choice here that's kickstarted this whole concern with the FAA was marijuana, right? Now I'm being monitored. Am I being monitored just for marijuana?
You're being monitored for all mood-altering substances.
So let's say I never really had an issue with drinking, but I like to drink here and there, right? And I'm in this HIMSS program. They're checking me for marijuana, but I go out one night and I, go to a bar with some friends. And I have a couple drinks. Nothing crazy. I don't get a DUI. I don't get blacked out drunk. I just had a couple drinks. And then the next day I get called for a random drug test by my HIMSS AME. I go in, I provide my specimen. Am I going to have a problem?
Oh, yeah, baby. You're screwed. You're
Why?
going back because now you've established that you broke abstinence, essentially. You're supposed to remain totally abstinent. And you did not do so. Now you're potentially looking at a substance dependence concern for continued use despite impairment of social, personal, occupational functioning. So,
Well, tiddlywinks.
tiddlywinks, for sure. Well, I've got to take a call, so wrap it up, Alex.
Well, I think that was a pretty good content-filled podcast.
Don't use any marijuana. Just
Yeah.
don't do it.
Don't do any drugs.
Yeah, don't do any marijuana, any cocaine.
You want to fly, you just kind of have to
Okay, I got to
be
make a call.
Straight-laced. Well, you've logged another uneventful half hour listening to the Pilot Lawyer podcast, and even though our wives kind of acknowledge us now,
They saw we were up to 28 subscribers.
Yeah.
They're like, hey,
there you go, these guys are getting serious here. We're the Ison Brothers of the Ison Law Firm. See you next time.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.